A very common opinion in the community when it comes to battle cats is that metal enemies are easily the worst trait in the game. There's a lot of arguments to be made, but generally the idea is that metals are too reliant on luck to beat, and therefore is just overall an unfair trait to exist in the game. Even though I think that metals are actually one of the most power crept traits in the game. Before we get into that, first let's have an overview on metal enemies and their gimmicks. Metal enemies are a type of trait in the game where visually generally would be having metallic body parts and glowing green eyes. All metal enemies share a gimmick, which is the ability of Metal Body. The Metal Body ability allows enemies to have an extremely high defense where any hits from your cat units will only do 1 damage to the metal's health. The only way to bypass this is if your units deal a critical hit. A cat unit's critical hit will deal double damage and bypass the Metal Body ability, delivering the full double damage. While this may sound like metal enemies can only be killed through critical hits, this is not entirely true because some metal enemies are designed to have extremely low health, low enough for them to be beatable without using critical hits at all. There are metal enemies that have tanky health, but they are also generally designed to be easily counterable with cats with critical hitters. On the other hand, cat units with critical hits are also usually balanced around metal enemies in mind. A majority of critical hitter units actually have lower damage than usual, making them usually not really viable outside of metals. There are a couple of exceptions, but usually those that are better against metals are going to have lower overall damage outside of metals, while the ones that are good outside of metals and have critical hits will usually have lower chance to crit, making them unreliable against metal enemies. There are a couple of handful exceptions, but these are very rare cases. The thing about critical hits is that critical hits are almost always a chance-based ability, meaning that when you are fighting a tanky metal enemy that requires critical hits to beat, you are not really able to deal any significant damage towards these enemies unless you get lucky with critical hits most of the time, and this is where most of the complaint stems from. The reason why people generally dislike metals or find metals to be troublesome or annoying is that because they have to rely on RNG to beat certain metal enemies. But in my opinion, I think this problem is heavily exaggerated a lot of the times. Now, I mentioned earlier that I personally think that metals are a power crap trait, but I do think that metals are quote-unquote one of the hard traits to fight against. They are hard, but I do not think that they are unfair. What's the difference? Well, the way I see it, unfair in a strategy game like Battle Cats means that the trait is badly designed in a way that it doesn't reward good strategies. It purely relies on luck and luck only, and your gameplay skills or your lineup building or your general strategy is not really rewarded in the process. That is unfair, but I disagree with this notion. I do not think that metals are unfair, but I do think that metals are hard. And by that, I mean metals are harder to understand in the sense of strategy game that is Battle Cats. It is trickier to understand metals compared to the other traits in the game and to learn on how to counter metals properly. But understanding the metal enemies and having good lineup and having good strategy, good gameplay will absolutely reward you with an easy win towards majority of metal stages. But hold on, you might say, you've just explained to us why metals are clearly RNG. Plus there's so many people complaining about metals, so there's definitely some truth to this to an extent. Well, here's the thing, like I said, metals actually is one of the harder traits to understand, and if you don't really understand metals, then yeah, you will be stumped by it because this is a strategy game in the end. Not understanding your enemies in the strategy game do generally lead you to a defeat. The thing about metals is that metals utilize knowledge that are rarely used. Anti-metals and critical hitters, like I mentioned earlier, are almost purely used on metals and nothing else. Units with critical hitters that are good against metals are not really usable anywhere else outside of metals, and units that are good against other traits are not really usually good against metals. So the units that you use against metal enemies are a subset of units that are rarely used, and therefore people don't usually understand the power of their own anti-metal units. Metal enemies are also pretty rare, so people don't generally try to bother to understand how to counter certain metal enemies properly, but most of the time the problem does come from not really understanding your own anti-metals, not really understanding how to use your anti-metals, and most especially is how to build your lineup against metal stages. So, let's talk about metal knowledge. The main 3 things to understand are the enemies, the cats, and lineup building. The easiest one to understand is probably the enemies because Battle Cats very rarely ever creates new metal enemies. They basically use the same like 3 metal enemies over and over and only add like 1 or 2 new metal enemies every like 2 or 3 years. Most of the metal enemies that we have are event enemies that rarely appears, and I don't want to get too deep into that, so I'm just gonna touch on the few that are very common. alone. If you're clicking on this video, chances are you at least already know about the main metal enemies, but I'm just gonna go through them real quick anyways, just to be sure. The 3 most common metal enemies that you're going to face are Metal Doge, Super Metal Hippo, and Sir Metal Seal. There are a couple of other special metal enemies that you might want to look out for, which is Cyberface and Coronium. Metal Doge is the quote-unquote weakest of the main 3, but not really, having the least amount of health and is a metal enemy that's generally balanced around being able to be killed through pure brute force and not fully needing critical hits to actually beat. Despite that, Metal Doge is still a very threatening presence in majority of the stages it's in, because it still takes a good while to actually kill a higher magnification Metal Doge without using critical hits. On top of that, a high magnification Metal Doge also deals quite a lot of chip damage. If you're not able to dispatch Metal Doges quickly with critical hits, they could stack up and chew through your defenses really fast. While it's not really needed to use critical hits on them, you might still want to bring them once in a while. If you let them live too long in certain stages, they can stack up and push way too hard. Next up on the list is Super Metal Hippo. This is one of the 2 main tankiest metal enemies that you're going to face. Super Metal Hippo has a moderately high HP, high enough to not get killed by most single random critical hits, and basically quote-unquote requires critical hits to actually beat. Super Metal Hippo doesn't actually deal that much damage, but it does have the ability to knock your units back. On top of that, while Super Metal Hippo isn't too tanky, it has a very high amount of knockback counts, meaning that using weaker critical hits on Super Metal Hippo would constantly reposition it without actually dealing that much damage. So the general counter towards Super Metal Hippo is by utilizing critical hitters that deals a big amount of damage in just one hit. The last common metal enemy on the list is Sir Metal Seal. This is probably most players' nightmare, the one metal enemy that basically everybody complains about. Sir Metal Seal is essentially a juggernaut of a unit. It has a very high health for a metal enemy and a very high damage output, especially in higher magnification. Sir Metal Seal is one hell of a tanker and generally takes many strong critical hits to actually dispatch. But the main weakness that Sir Metal Seal has is that Sir Metal Seal has one of the lowest range when it comes to metal enemies, and therefore is very susceptible to being debuffed, just like most Cyclone enemies. Keep in mind that all 3 of these common metal enemies have short range. Super Metal Hippo having the highest range of them all, and it even then is barely anything. Majority of the anti-metal or critical hitter units that we have always outranges them, so range might not really matter against these enemies aside from very specific interactions. The other 2 metal enemies that you're going to want to look out for are Cyberface and Coronium. Both of these are waivers and actually have a very strong presence on the field. Their waves are very powerful and they need to be dealt with as soon as possible, but luckily they also both have very small amount of health. Any weak critical hits towards them will pretty much always kill them. It's also very possible to brute force them if you play careful enough. Also, Coronium is pretty much the only metal enemy in this list that actually have a range. Coronium is actually able to outrange majority of the anti-metal and critical hitters that we have when it comes to the No Uber catalog anyways, so his presence is always notable. But most of the times there's very easy setup to just kill Coronium by isolating him alone, so even then, most stages that he's in is usually not that bad. So then let's move on towards anti-metal cat units. Now okay, I know that I said that anti-metal knowledge is important, but there's a lot of anti-metal and critical hitters out there. If I were to go and review every single one of them, it can take a very long time. I'm going to still try to go through them because I think it's important to do so, but I'll try to not make it too long. So when it comes to No Uber anti-metals, most of the cats that we have are actually stage drop from Cyclones, and a lot of these Cyclone stages are early to mid-game stages. This even includes their Rat and Revenge stage to unlock their true forms. Cyclone stages also cycles every week, so you won't be able to miss them easily. Point is, these units are extremely accessible. By the time you're somewhere in mid-game or late SOL, there's very little excuse to not have basically majority or all of them. There's 2 types of units to counter metals: critical hitters and anti-metals. Anti-metals includes things like anti-metal debuffers. The main ones that drop from Cyclones are Hoopcat, Puppet Master, and Mochi, which does freeze, slow, and weaken respectively. Quizmaster is a unit that exists. All of these 3 that I mentioned are short-range debuffers, and they're all amazing in their own rights. Hoop being the one with freeze, which has the best effect out of the 3, Puppet Master being the slow is ironically the fastest one out of all of them and also have a very long slow debuff, while Mochi with the weaken is the most consistent one out of them all, especially in true form. There's little reason to want to debuff weaker metal enemies like Metal Doges, since it's usually better to just kill them rather than try to debuff them, but all 3 of these debuffers are very powerful to counter the tanky metal enemies, especially Sir Metal Seal. Having 1 or 2 of these debuffers in your team can lock down Sir Metal Seal hard and can turn that enemy from an actual threat to just basically a sitting duck. Mochi is also really good against Super Metal Hippo because remember, Super Metal Hippo has an innate knockback ability, and Mochi's weakening effect allows your units to survive significantly longer because you can abuse Super Metal Hippo's knockback ability to save your own unit. I've also talked a little bit about how Weaken is an amazing ability that you should look into in my previous video, so go watch that if you're interested. There's also Talented Lollycat. Lollycats have a talent to grant its slow metal ability. If you know Sanzo, Talented Lolly is basically that against metals, but so much better in terms of range and cooldown. It's an absurdly good anti-metal unit against a group of metal enemies, and the safe standing range helps a lot when against a high ranger supports or high range metal enemies like Coronium. Aside from anti-metal debuffers, there's also anti-metal meat shields, which mainly just consist of Modern Cat and Noodles, but even then Noodles kind of sucks, so just consider Modern Cat. Like any other specialized meat shields, Modern is great when the stage only consists of the trait it counters, but falls in effectiveness if there's other traits in the stage. Now, moving on to crit units. I can divide crit units into 3 different types: a high frequency but low damage crit, a high damage but low frequency crit, and a general crit. This is kind of more of a spectrum though. Some units are leaning slightly more to the one side than the other. High frequency, low damage crit units are best used to counter metal peons or any metals with low health. For example, Little Doges, Coronium, and Cyberface, which tends to get one-shotted by any crits. They're terrible against Super Metal Seal and Super Metal Hippo as they barely do any damage. It's even worse on Super Metal Hippo as they would knock them back often, which only increases their own survivability. Common meta units in this category would be Huricat and Aku Researcher. I would also count $1 Million and Felix Duke Cat to fall in this category because they have guaranteed crits that can be used to snipe down Coronium and Cyberface, but not a good enough damage to deal with Super Metal Hippo and Super Metal Seal. On the other side of the spectrum is low frequency but high damage crits. They are best used to counter the tanky metal enemies, being Sir Seal and Super Metal Hippo. A powerful new critical hit is always amazing against Super Metal Hippo because you don't want to knock it back too much. Common meta units in this category would be Waitress Cat, Craze Maneko, and Summer Naneko. All 3 of these units have guaranteed crit chance, by the way. They do have a relatively long time between attacks, but the guaranteed crit chance and the very high damage output that they give makes them an amazing asset all around against metal enemies. Talented Cameraman Cat and Island Cats also fall into this category, though Island is not really a unit I would generally recommend against metal stages. Cameraman and the Island Cats have very low crit chance, but a very high damage output if the crit actually happens. And it's very nice on Cameraman since she has a mid-range attack and a spammable cooldown, so a single crit from her can deal with a group of metal enemies at once. Units with the Metal Killer ability also generally falls into this category, because Metal Killers, which cuts down metal enemies through their health percentage, is generally better against tanky metal enemies rather than peon type enemies. Finally, there are the general crit units, which is kind of the in-between of both of these. General crits can counter most metal enemies in most situations. They don't crit too often, but they crit often enough to be able to deal with weaker metal peons. They don't deal super high damage, but they deal enough damage to make a dent on the tankier metal enemies. The common units that fall into this category are Catasaurus and Curry Cat. These are your go-to if you don't know what to bring or if you need to compress your lineup against multiple metal enemies. Most uber critical hitters also go into this category, although like I said, this is kind of a spectrum, so it does heavily depend on which ubers. But yeah, that's about it for anti-metal units. I do need to say that almost every unit that I've mentioned are very powerful units. We have an amazing selection of anti-metal and critical hitters that are super powerful if you know how to use them. Huricat is always amazing against group of metal doges. Hoopcat is really powerful against Sir Metal Seal. Curry is an amazing range stackable critical hitter, plus a guaranteed chance to slow, so it's both a critical hitter and a debuffer at the same time. Waitress is amongst one of the absolute best critical hitter units in the game. Despite her long attack animation and attack rate, her stackable standing range, amazing damage, and guaranteed crit chance allows her to be absurdly powerful on majority of the metal stages that we have. And the fact that her crit chance is guaranteed means that you don't even need to rely on RNG to make her work. And finally is Catasaurus, especially with talents, is able to work on basically almost every situation and will always perform at least decently, especially on higher levels. Not to mention, Catasaurus and Little Mohawk Cat are part of the Minisaurus combo, which is a research combo. Not only that these two units are extremely easy to slot in any metal stages, but research combo is just an amazing combo all around. I have a video talking more in depth about research combo, go watch that if you're interested. Speaking of combos, there's also crit combos. Crit combos gives a flat crit chance to the critical hitter units in your team. Only 1% bonus at small and 2% bonus at medium, meaning that units that already have a naturally high chance to crit don't really benefit from this combo. But if your units rely on low crit chance with constant attacks, then this combo can do amazing things to certain units on either category of critical hitters. Not to mention, all of the crit combos we have so far always feature features anti-metals and critical hitters. Miracle Performance especially is not only great because of the 2% extra crit chance effect, but the crit units that comes with it are also pretty solid. Maneko, despite her terrible cooldown and mediocre crit chance, is basically free to spawn and have an amazing nuke damage potential if the crit actually lands. Crazy Maneko, despite her long attack animation and unsafe range, has the best attack rate for a critical hit that is guaranteed. And the crit damage is also pretty high. She can work for both nuking tanky metal enemies and also taking down weaker peons one by one. I would say she's actually very underrated when it comes to critical hitters. So as you can see, our selections of anti-metal units are very amazing. There's always a unit for every situation, and those units are all amazing at their job. But you might say, well, okay, I kind of already knew about all of that though. I use Hurricane for metal doges, I use the nuker units for Star Metal Seal, and I use crit combos, but metals are still really frustrating because it's all luck. Well, let me go back to the previous point again. Just knowing about metal enemies and anti-metal units is just part of the battle. There's still one more important thing to do, and that is lineup building. Your units still need to work as a team, and having to counter one metal enemy in the stage does not immediately remove that metal enemy from the stage. Most hard metal stages are often mixed traits, so your team need to work together as the enemy team works together as well. You might know how to counter the metal enemies, but can you counter the metal enemies alongside their supports? When you lose against these stages, do you think, oh, I just need better luck, and I need more critical hitters, and I need more anti-metals? Is that your line of thinking? But here's the thing, let me tell you a very interesting secret to prepare against metal stages. A wisdom passed from generations to generations. The sacred text that the ancients have used as their true counter against metals. Are you ready to learn the ultimate truth? Well, the secret tech to lineup building against metal enemies is sometimes you need less anti-metals on your team. Sometimes the answer is to bring something else that are not critical hitters or anti-metals. Sometimes you just gotta bring something else for the other enemies in the stage, like bringing waivers or LD units to abuse the metal enemy's tankiness, which is a very common strategy in metal stages, by the way. There's a lot of stages where you can just ignore bringing critical hits or anti-metal units because you actually want to keep certain metal enemies alive to abuse their tankiness by stacking up piercing units to demolish everything behind them. Sometimes having metal enemies in the stage actually makes the stage easier if you know how to abuse them. Hell, sometimes the answer to metal stages is to just bring more meat shields. Sometimes people are too focused on bringing crits that they forgot to actually defend their crit units with proper defense. This might sound obvious, but dude, your crit units will never land a crit if they can't land an attack at the first place. Oh no, I lost because my Catosaurus never crits. It's all luck. You kept sending Catosaurus to his death. You're expecting his corpse to crit or something? Wait, now that you mentioned it, maybe that's not a bad idea actually. Anyways, point is, there's a lot more creative ways you can do to help win metal stages aside from just hoping for dumb luck. I asked you guys in a community post about which metal stages you guys have trouble with the most, and I've tried them myself and tried to get my hands on these stages and figure out what's generally the best way to counter them, and legitimately, majority of these stages answers are just more meat shields. Yes, this includes 3-star Total Myopia, which is arguably one of the hardest metal stages aside from March to Death. I was trying out different lineups with it, and the most consistent lineup I had against this stage is when I just add an extra Eraser Cat on my team. Not about putting more crits, not about putting more anti-metals, no. I just added a second Eraser Cat in my team, and I get a very consistent result. So yeah, lineup building really matters. On top of that, complaints about RNG is a little flimsy since, okay, number one, in some metal stages, you don't even have to rely on RNG if you don't want to. Remember, there are crit units that have guaranteed chance to crit. Crazy Maneko and Waitress both have guaranteed crits, and they're both really good crit units. Summer Naneko is also really good. If you're tired of relying on RNG, then don't. You can choose not to. All of these units are very good. They often even outperform majority of the crit units that we have. But sure, maybe sometimes these units don't really work too well against certain metal stages. So point number 2 is that this, dude, you know what you're playing? This whole game is RNG, dude. Like, there's so many things that rely on RNG in this game. As a matter of fact, remember where you got your anti-metal units from? From Cyclone stages. Cyclone stages are literally RNG stages. There's a lot of RNG stages in the game. Hell, some of the worst RNG based stages in the game are not even metal stages. I'll Be Bug is one of the absolute most luck based stage in the game that I have had the displeasure to play. And there's no metal enemies here. This stage is so heavily reliant on luck. And yet I see more people complaining about March to Death when this stage exists. Ah yes, I love when my Rocat gets permanently slowed by Professor A for like the 10th time in a row, and then my Rocat never lands its weaken effect. Awesome, I love that. To top it all off, dude, this is a gacha game. Like, majority of the units that you have are obtained from luck. The gacha luck is significantly worse compared to fighting metal enemies. And you might be like, well, I can still choose which banner I want to roll. I can still choose to be more effective with my cat food or rare ticket spending. Well, guess what? You can also do a lot of things to change your luck in metal stages too. When losing to metal stage, it does feel easier to blame pure luck rather than trying to understand what you can do to change the outcome. I mean, I get it. I get why you would think that way. But in reality, there's actually quite a lot of things you can do that factors into whether you win or lose against a metal stage. In general, you actually have a lot more impact and a lot more to input. You may not be able to control how luck works, but you can make a lot of change to maximize your luck. And with good enough planning, with good enough strategizing, with good enough knowledge, you can basically ensure a victory. That's just how life is. You may not be able to fully manipulate how luck in the world works or how others will plan their day. The world's revolving without a single care for you. You can be at the topmost of the food chain of society, but even when you're a big shot, the biggest of them all, you can't control everything. And no matter how big you get, you'll never reach true freedom in the world. But that doesn't mean your actions are worthless. You may not be able to control how the wind blows or what the weather will be, or who you will meet in school, or who you will meet in work, or who would approach you with a job opportunity, who would look at your general direction and fall in love with you. And it's easy to blame other people or blame the world for how people act towards you, and it's easy to act like we never got a say in how things work in life. But if you look into yourself, we have a lot more power than you think. If you dress nicer, if you start greeting other people more, if you spend more time learning how to make a better CV, if you start to open up more to your friends, open up more to your family, if you decide to spend less time doom scrolling Twitter or TikTok or whatever, or maybe set a strict timer on social medias, then the world may be kinder to you. Hell, even if you can't do anything to change the weather, you can still bring an umbrella to make sure you don't get soaked. Even if you can't change certain things, the way you respond to it can be changed. You have power within you. Strengthen your will. Strengthen your resolve, and know that through determination, we all have the power to shape the world around us. We can't shape everything perfectly to what we imagine, and we can't shape everything all at once, but we can still shape the future, kneading the clay of humanity bit by bit. It's going to take a lot of self-reflection, and it's going to be painful. You might fail a lot of times, you're going to doubt yourself a lot. I mean, frankly, I have my own doubts too, but despite that, I do hope that my words can move the world ever so slightly to the direction more positive. I'm still struggling myself on a day-to-day basis, but games are not fun without a little challenge now, isn't it? Oh yeah, we were talking about battle cats. Still, I hope my words can shape you too, so that you will also believe in your own will, in your own power, in your own determination. You can tell that I might have been playing a little bit too much Deltarune, but anyways, that is all. Hope you learn a thing or two, whether it's about battle cats or about life, and I'll catch you another time. See ya.